Hello all, today we're going to be talking about a form of social organisation known as meritocracy. So meritocracies get talked about a lot in the West. It's something that we strive to have, it seems like, at least in mainstream media when it's mentioned a lot of the times. A lot of people try and advocate that we need to move towards more meritocratic values. And in this video, I want to break down exactly what that means and why people support it and why people are critical of it. So I think we should start by defining meritocracy, and instantly you'll find that's actually something quite difficult to do. So despite this sort of liberal way that meritocracy gets flown about, it seems to have quite broad implications, right? There are different ways of implementing a meritocracy, and so two societies that seem to purport meritocratic values can have differing outcomes. So let's start broadly, and then we can dive into more nuances and see how meritocracies can differ in certain ways. Well, the term meritocracy was first used in Michael Young's satirical piece, The Rise of Meritocracy. And just broadly speaking, meritocracy advocates for positions and goods to be distributed solely in accordance with individual merit. In Michael Young's piece, he describes merit as IQ plus effort. Now, what's interesting already about Michael Young's piece is that it's actually a dystopian future novel. And so, as mentioned, despite the way that meritocracy seems to be used in positive light in modern day, it actually came about as a negative term. So those who advocate for a meritocratic organisation suppose that a meritocracy is opposed to arbitrary discrimination because it focuses solely on merit. And as we described, merit is IQ plus effort if we use Michael Young's original notion. And so the idea that we only use IQ plus effort to discriminate between people seems fair to those who support meritocracy because, you're discriminating people based on their hard work and their natural ability. One scholar, Elizabeth Anderson, highlights that a traditional meritocracy does not care about people's background, it just wants the most productive workers. And so it seems on the surface level that job allocations and rewards in societies of a meritocratic organisation seem to be done pretty fairly since they're based on one's natural ability and motivation. So as I kind of prefaced, we need to highlight that meritocracies aren't monolithic. So there are different ways you can organise one. So just to kind of go into one way that two meritocracies can differ. So one meritocracy might look at society in a sort of macro and holistic way or adopt macro principles, and another might adopt micro. So let's concrete that with a hypothetical situation. So let's imagine you have person A and a person B, and they're applying for two jobs, job 1 and job 2. They both want job 1 significantly over job 2, that's their preference. So person A is slightly better than person B for job 1, and that's a job that both of them would prefer. But for job 2, person A is way better than person B. So how would a meritocracy deal with this kind of issue? So in the kind of macro view, you might look at both jobs and the whole society in general and try and observe what way can we allocate these jobs to minimise the losses throughout all of society. And so you might actually decide to give job 1 to person B, despite the fact that person B is slightly worse than person A. And through that you would then give job 2 to person A. Now they both wanted job 1, but you're actually giving job 1 to the slightly worse candidate, even though it's a meritocracy. And the reason for that is because overall throughout society you're actually minimizing your losses because that person B would be way too bad at job 2. On the micro level you might say, no, let's view these jobs individually. Both want job 1, person A is slightly better, let's give it to him, and then we'll have to give job 2 to person B if there's obviously no one around in this hypothetical scenario. So just through that you can kind of explore how a meritocracy isn't monolithic and how there are actual slight differences there. So as I've explained so far, it seems like meritocracies are pretty good things. They seek to avoid arbitrary discrimination because they only really care who has the best IQ and who puts in the most effort. And that seems fair, to discriminate people on their ability, perhaps for certain jobs. Maybe some of us would think, it's tough and, it seems unfair because people are sometimes just born with a higher IQ or lower IQ, but that's just the way the world works. But one person had an issue with meritocracies in general, and I want to talk about John Rawls and his conception of meritocracies and why he was opposed to them. So in John Rawls' The Theory of Justice, he goes through deciding how to organise a society through a unique way. The way Rawls imagines the ideal social organisation or the ideal society is by imagining you're a fetus, you're yet to be born into a world, and because of that you don't know if you're going to be born into a poorer family or a richer family. You don't know what your access to education is going to be like because you don't know, you could be born to absolutely anyone. You could be born in a really peaceful and nice area, or you could be born in a particularly rough and violent area. As a result of all of those unknowns, being in that position, in the fetus stage, which he calls the original position, where you can kind of see the world but you don't know where you're going to be placed in it, How would you design the ideal society so that you felt comfortable to go into that world, and no matter where you were, you had enough insurance to ensure that you had the possibility to develop a good life? So in his American 20th century context, he says there are some things that the US society is lacking that perhaps the Scandinavian countries would have. And when you're in that original position or the fetus stage, one might say, oh, well, I'd like to go into a meritocracy. So despite whatever happens, I have the opportunity to develop my merit through hard work, and then at least have a chance to develop a good and positive life despite where I come from. Now, actually, Rawls was clearly against the traditional idea of a meritocracy. And now, before I go on, I will say that John Rawls has a sort of rigid conception of meritocracy. And as we just broke down, it seems like quite a complex thing that can be nuanced and different in different contexts. But regardless, let's explore what Rawls has to say and why he was so against a meritocracy. So in Rawls' more rigid conception of a meritocracy, he suggests that it risks prioritising economic efficiency to the point of justifying poor treatment of those who are unlucky, who weren't born with those natural endowments or that high IQ potential. And to summarise that, for Rawls, a meritocracy selects champions and marginalises people who are born in unlucky environments or with unfortunate natural endowments. For Rawls, being born with a low potential to develop IQ, he thinks it's just unlucky. And when you're in that original position, one of the things that you don't know when you're going to come into the world is whether you're born with that potential to develop a high IQ. And so he's saying that a meritocracy would mean that in the original position, that's something that you wouldn't like, because what if you don't have the potential to develop enough merit in order to succeed in a meritocracy? Additionally, the idea of having IQ plus hard work, he also kind of sees hard work as something that's developed through a certain environment. So what if the environment you're born into is so bad where you just lacked all ambition because you never saw the possibility to leave that context? In that sense, it's also unlucky, because then your environment is determining your potential to do hard work in a similar sense. Furthermore, there is a risk of overlooking how some candidates therefore have a greater opportunity to develop merit in a meritocracy. When you kind of view candidates along the lines of who has the best merit, it seems like you're simplifying the history and the individuality of the person. What if one person had a greater opportunity to develop their merit? What if another didn't? Now, moving away from Rawls' critique, another critique comes from a kind of feminist philosophy. So some have highlighted that a meritocracy stands in the way of affirmative action. And of course, affirmative action is something extremely controversial. It's something that exists today in the US and in some forms around the world. And it's something that a lot of people agree with and think that it is just, and that's something that other people think is completely unjust. So in general, there is a traditional meritocratic argument of social justice, which reports that individuals get what they deserve based on their merit. But two scholars, Adam Swift and Gordon Marshall, suggest that we need to be critical of claims of desert and consider the role of luck in influencing people's possession of natural ability and motivation. Essentially, they were echoing the argument I'd made previously before, which is a meritocracy doesn't scrutinise between the different opportunities people had to develop a merit. And essentially, a meritocracy can be likened to something John Rawls calls formal equality of opportunity. And this is opposed to something he describes as fair equality of opportunity. So the difference there between formal and fair is that formal has been described by other scholars as being a de jure equality of opportunity, as opposed to fair equality of opportunity, which is de facto equality of opportunity. Now, both formal and fair equality of opportunity have the ambitions of avoiding arbitrary discrimination. So let's explain the difference between formal and fair equality of opportunity through another example. So if we were to implement a meritocratic government in a society which historically had class inequalities, we may perpetuate those class inequalities. For example, if upper-class families had historically attended the best universities, there is privilege in coming from one of those families as knowledge and experience is passed down, which helps one develop merit in a way that's not available to everyone. And so within that example, a society that perpetuated fair equality of opportunity as opposed to formal would seek to provide extra measures for those who are denied those benefits of learning from previous family experiences. Fair equality of opportunity is motivated by the fact that implicit arbitrary discrimination can still exist despite not being written into a constitution. And so in that sense, you can argue that fair equality of opportunity has a potential for increased economic opportunity compared to a meritocracy or formal equality of opportunity. Since it targets a wider demographic of people, not only does it seek to hire or reward the people that have the most that have the most merit, but it also seeks to provide measures so that everyone has ample opportunity to develop merit. Alongside economic efficiency, fair quality of opportunity is also driven through its case for social justice. At the heart of John Rawls' social organisation of society, it's not necessarily economic efficiency, although that can certainly be a core case. It's also this idea of self-fulfilment. When you have a meritocracy that perhaps doesn't consider how people lack the opportunity to develop merit, what can occur as a result of that marginalisation is that people also lack the opportunity to develop themselves. So under Rawls' argument, fair quality of opportunity allows a greater number of people to choose and evaluate their conception of what's meaningful. It's bringing more people up to that level of a higher merit, or at least that's what it seeks to do. And decision making between different opportunities for different jobs, it's an important element for human flourishing and therefore something one would wish to have in the original position. Freedom to choose a line of work is an important mode for self-expression. Now, a lot of this seems easier said than done. How exactly are we just going to magically bring up everyone so they have more opportunity to develop that merit? It's pretty complicated. And so as mentioned earlier, one way is affirmative action. And Thomas Nagel describes affirmative action as a policy intended to deal with unjust consequences of an unjust history. Thomas Nagel says it aims to work against discriminations which are implicit. For example, increasing representation of traditionally oppressed minorities in the institutions to motivate those who identify with those minority groups and would otherwise lack this ambition. Now, a lot of people would agree that sort of in a vacuum, just looking at the idea of affirmative action, it does seem not likeable. It seems unjust, but when you view it in the context of its history, it seems to try and work to undo unjust things in the past. In some aspects, it also seeks to recognise that an individual would have been the most qualified or would have had the most merit if it was not for suffering injustices. Now Rawls doesn't go into this much detail, and it's unclear whether Rawls' fair quality of opportunity wants to promote affirmative action or not. One scholar, Robert Allen, seeks to distinguish between different degrees of affirmative action and what we kind of like and what we don't like. So on the first level, you could argue that affirmative action brings the field of competition to individuals who would otherwise be left out. There's a specific emphasis on those who are victims of injustices or belong to a group of whom a significant portion have been treated unfairly. And now to take that step further, in a society where you have affirmative action, you may seek to give a member of a disadvantaged group a sought-after position in the event that she is as qualified for it as other aspirants. And finally, the most radical, members of a disadvantaged group have a fixed number of coveted positions in a university or job placement set aside for them. And so this is to sort of set quotas to have X number of people from X demographic. So Allen's view is that the most radical out of those three, so to have coveted positions set aside for certain demographics, would replicate the very inequality it was supposed to remedy. And that's what a lot of critics of affirmative action seem to argue, that you're not going to undo unjust history by furthering unjust policies. But then to go back to Nagel, he states that if these measures were introduced to an already just society, it would make it unjust. But modern societies are not just. So in my view, I can see circumstances where the third and most radical position I described of affirmative action is desirable. So imagine the following. So once again, let's draw on that example of an upper-class family passing down experiential knowledge to their children. And this seems like an unfair disadvantage for everyone else. For the sake of this example, let's imagine that this unfair skill is something like interview etiquette. I think it makes sense for schools or other authorities to proactively identify children with these unfair disadvantages and offer targeted programs to help bring the field of competition to those who would otherwise be left out. Now, if these programs had limited spaces, it seems justifiable to target a specific stratum of people over another, rather than giving all children equal access. So, in that sense, it means having specific positions for those with lower income families or from families that have never had parents that went to university or something of that nature. I think this reasoning is justified on the idea that some are denied sufficient access to develop merit or an opportunity relative to their competitors. Another example could be, let's say it's known that private tutoring classes are expensive. Then it's reasonable for an after-school class with limited spaces to first target children from lower income families. Now, on the other hand, if there was no options for anyone to receive private tutoring altogether, despite whatever income you have, this targeting may no longer be justified. So I think it's important here to mention an issue with the idea of complete fair equality of opportunity. So if we're going to have these policies of affirmative action or things similar to enable us to sort of have everyone on an exact level playing field, that seems undesirable in my opinion as well. I think that it's not agreeable to have complete fair equality of opportunity, and I would argue for something that sounds something more like sufficient equality of opportunity. So the idea of having a sufficient level of equal opportunity is relative, and it rests on being able to identify the average available opportunity for everyone else. And so the word sufficient means equal enough, not complete, but something that's okay and works. So the main issue I find when you're really trying to gun for this level playing field ideal is that there's always a further step to go. If you take it to the absolute extremes, you're denying family autonomy. You're essentially saying that every individual must have the exact same experiences from the point they're born until they take these IQ tests or exams, to ensure that there's no environmental injustice that one suffered compared to another. Very quickly, this turns into sort of a communist ideal where all children are reared and brought up together, and then they take an exam so you can find which is the best and which isn't. And the reason why that denies a sort of family autonomy is because essentially you're not letting parents make their own decisions in rearing their children. And so if we wanted complete equality of opportunity, just how far would we find it acceptable for a government to monitor and regulate individuals so they don't stray too far from this exact equal? So one scholar, Richard Arneson, believes that there are aspects of personal life which should not be encroached on, despite its hindering on the attainment of equality of opportunity. So he gives the example of religious freedom. Imagine person A has a faith which preaches competitive striving as the highest good, and person B comes from a faith that preaches laid-back gratefulness. This can easily have an impact on one's potential to develop merit, but it seems like something we should allow. It seems like Rawls' quite broad notion of fair equality of opportunity is aware of this. He has a hierarchy of things that should be prioritised over others no matter what, and his fair equality of opportunity comes secondary to a list of basic liberties, things like the ability for freedom of speech or freedom to vote and things of that nature. They come first. So you should never have that sort of complete totalitarian society which denies the individual flourishing of parents, to rear their children in the way that they want. And he seems to acknowledge that fair equality of opportunity shouldn't exactly be complete. And so Rawls is clearly saying in his hierarchy that if fair equality of opportunity was to clash with any of the basic liberties should be prioritised. So I find the argument for allowing family diversity or diversity in family experiences quite compelling. The issue is that the more individuality and freeness of family life, the greater the chances of inequality, since parents offer varying degrees of familial relationships, money, time, energy and cultural capital. My sort of sufficiency position holds that diverse levels of familial relationship goods are allowed to be exercised. But essentially you need to have this barrier where if you can see that one's not receiving enough of these goods, and that's relative to the average goods that the person receives in a society, then they need a bit of a boost. Something like affirmative action seems justified in those cases I described. That being said, I would never support a sort of policy that requires the forbiddance of parents to help their children. And so that's why I'm opposed to the complete equality of opportunity argument. And so there, what I want to say is that there should be redistribution in some sense. When I say sufficient equality of opportunity, I think there's potential for people to slip below that sufficient level of opportunity in which they need help. But on the other hand, you can have those who slip too high and develop a sort of monopoly over resources to develop their merit, in which case I think it's justified to have some sort of redistribution to ensure continual sufficient resources are available for all. And so let's bring that all together again. We started with this meritocracy where you have this wanting to avoid arbitrary discrimination. You simply just want the most efficient workers, and the way to do that is by awarding positions and awards based on one's merit, which can be described as IQ plus effort in its most basic sense. Now, John Rawls sort of disagrees with this idea of a meritocracy, this utopian ideal. He says that, there's a risk that you're prioritising economic efficiency, and it's unfair for those who are just born without a natural potential to develop IQ, or for those who don't have the opportunity to develop their merit. Rawls, although broad and kind of vague at points, he says that perhaps we need to have these other measures or some sort of social welfare or resources to ensure people have an opportunity to develop merit, no matter what sort of environment or background they come from. In that sense, we need to ensure that whatever social welfare or provision that the government or whichever institution gives to these individuals. I don't think we should strive to ensure that there is a complete level playing field, because that would have an adverse effect on one's ability to live their own life and their own autonomy to make their own decisions. However, if one strays too far from this sort of bowl of this average of opportunity available to all, then they need some sort of pickup. Now, I've highlighted a few ways to keep opportunities to develop merit within certain boundaries, such as affirmative action or levelling down to an extent, but these aren't the only options. So, a scholar, Joseph Fishkin, highlights the need to increase the range of opportunities open to people at all stages of life. He states that we need to subsidise and encourage more opportunities and pathways for self-fulfilment to be realised in more opportunities. Otherwise, we'll inevitably have bottlenecks, and by attempting to equalise opportunities for every individual further, we'll only create more demand for the same few roles. Ultimately, my notion of sufficiency demands considerable redistribution of wealth, but unlike complete equality of opportunity, it still leaves considerable differences in income and wealth once everyone has enough. I want to avoid equality of opportunity becoming equality of outcome, and therefore maintain creative spaces for individuals to demonstrate self-expression. Okay, that was a video. I kind of walked through quite a complex philosophical topic with a lot of hypotheticals, and I would love to know how you felt about that. If you have any thoughts on how I did or any thoughts on how I can improve, I'd really appreciate listening to them, but I guess bye-bye for now.